Welcome to the deep dive. Our job here is to take the most complicated foundational questions in human thought, distill the academic research, and give you the absolute core knowledge, complete with the surprising facts that stick with you.
Today, we're undertaking a conceptual mission that seems, on the surface, trivially easy: defining literature.
Right. It feels like one of those things we all know when we see it. We talk about literary movements, literary history, literary genius.
And we build entire university departments and publishing houses on the assumption that literature is a stable, definable category of writing.
Exactly. But if you stop and try to identify the one fundamental intrinsic property, the essence that ties, say, Beowulf to Virginia Woolf, the definition just melts away.
It's the ultimate paradox of the field. Literary theory, it presupposes the existence of literature, but as soon as you try to pin down what it is, your logical ground just completely collapses.
So that's our mission today.
That's the mission. We're going to follow the intellectual trail laid out by our sources, and we're going to examine the three most common historical and theoretical attempts to define literature.
And show why they fail.
And show why they invariably fail, which leads us to a much deeper and, perhaps a more unsettling conclusion about where literary value actually comes from.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start where everyone starts, with the most intuitive definition that probably pops into everyone's head the moment they hear the word literature.
The obvious one.
Literature is imaginative writing. It is fiction. It's writing which is definitively not literally true. That is surely the starting point for differentiating it from, say, history or science.
That is the initial assumption. And it's the very first place the definition fails. The moment you look beyond our modern, highly specialized concepts of genre and actually examine the historical canon.
What Western culture has actually included under that banner.
Exactly. That simple assumption proves completely inadequate.
Okay, I need some specifics here, because in my modern mind, the line is drawn quite cleanly between a novel and a scientific paper. So what historical examples violate this fact-fiction boundary?
Oh, the violation is widespread, particularly when we look at English and French writing from the 17th to the 19th centuries.
Oh.
When you study 17th century English literature, you have to include the great poets and playwrights, yes, but
But you also get a ton of nonfiction.
a ton of it. Works that are decidedly nonfiction.
Such as?
Well, think of the works of Francis Bacon, his philosophical and moral essays, or John Donne's powerful sermons. These were rhetorical masterpieces, absolutely central to the literary world of the time.
But they were presented as truth, as instruction.
Yes, and received as factual or instructional truth. We also include Bunyan's spiritual autobiography, which is a personal testimony intended as a religious account. And, depending on the breadth of the curriculum, you get foundational, philosophical, and political texts like Hobbes's Leviathan.
Or Clarendon's History of the Rebellion. These often find themselves right alongside the plays and poetry.
It's an issue of rhetorical skill transcending the subject matter, isn't it? The sheer eloquence of these nonfictional works just forced their inclusion.
Precisely. And this pattern repeats all over Europe. In 17th century French literature, for example, the canon embraces the tragedies of Corneille and Racine, sure.
But right alongside them
are the maxims of La Rochefoucauld, the deeply theological funeral speeches of Bossuet, the letters of Madame de Sévigné.
And crucially, the philosophy of Descartes and Pascal.
None of these figures were presenting their work as some kind of invented narrative. They were presenting truth or advice or pure observation.
That's the whole point. And this anomaly, this problem, it persists right into the 19th century. English literature typically includes essayists like Charles Lamb and Thomas Macaulay.
And figures like John Stuart Mill. They're all praised for their style and rhetorical elegance.
Right, but then you have to look at who is almost invariably excluded. Giants of factual, foundational thought, like Karl Marx or Charles Darwin or Jeremy Bentham.
They get relegated.
Yeah.
To sociology, biology, economics.
The distinction between fact and fiction just doesn't hold up as an organizing principle. So why is Lamb writing factual or observational essays in, while Marx, writing a foundational economic critique, is out?
It suggests an entirely different selection criterion is at play. Something other than truth value.
It does. And what's more, the fact-fiction line itself is historically much, much shadier than we imagine. We assume this opposition is universal, but it's not.
What do you mean?
Well, in the ancient world, and certainly in the age of the early Icelandic sagas, the opposition we now draw between historical truth and artistic truth. It just didn't really apply. They were operating under a completely different intellectual framework.
And even the genres themselves were unstable.
Oh, totally. For instance, in England, during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the very word novel was used without distinction. It could refer to accounts of events believed to be true and purely fictional narratives.
So the sharp institutionalized discriminations we make today between historical and imaginative categories simply weren't fixed.
They weren't. And how we read a text can change its category dynamically over time. Think about Gibbon.
The history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire.
Right. He certainly believed he was compiling historical truth. Yet today, many people read it primarily for its magnificent prose, its rhetorical power, and its dramatic sweep.
They're consuming it as literature, sometimes even discounting its detailed accuracy.
Or consider Newman's theological meditations. They were intended and received as factual spiritual truth. Today, a reader might treat them as brilliant rhetoric, a meditation on language and faith, and thereby classify them as literature.
So the status of the work is unstable. It's dependent on the reader's cultural moment.
Exactly. So if we define literature as purely imaginative writing, we run into two massive problems. First, we exclude huge chunks of the established historical canon.
And second, we're implicitly suggesting that history, philosophy, and natural science, by being non-literature, are somehow inherently uncreative or unimaginative pursuits.
Which is clearly false. And of course, the reverse problem exists. We exclude huge swaths of pure fiction from the definition of literature with a capital L.
Right. There's a lot of writing that's imaginary. It's like, say, Mills and Boon romances or Superman comic books, but they're generally not granted full literary status.
So fictionality, therefore, is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for a text to be considered literature. The whole idea falls apart.
Okay, so the attempt to define literature based on content on fiction is a failure. It's unreliable, historically unstable, and just inconsistent. So let's pivot. If it's not about what it says, maybe the essence is in the form.
In how it's said.
Right. And this takes us to the brilliant, albeit short-lived, movement known as Russian formalism.
This is a revolutionary shift. The formalists, who were active in Russia in the 1910s and 20s, they tried to define literature not by its subject matter or its truth value, but by its distinct and peculiar use of language.
They define it as language that draws attention to itself.
That's the core of it. And the key concept here is linguistic transformation. The critic Roman Jakobson famously described literary language as an organized violence committed on ordinary speech.
That's a fantastic phrase.
It's a great summary of their philosophy. They believe that literature transforms, it intensifies, and it systematically deviates from the baseline of everyday speech. It is language operating under duress, operating self-consciously.
This is where we need to introduce a key piece of linguistic theory, the relationship between the signifiers and the signifieds. For anyone less familiar, can you break down how the formalists saw this relationship working in literature compared to ordinary speech?
Sure. So think of language as a tool. In ordinary, pragmatic speech like reading a stop sign or a text message, our attention shoots straight past the word itself.
The signifier, the physical sound, or the mark on the page.
Right. Past the signifier to the concept it represents, the signified, the meaning. We want efficiency. We just want the abstractable meaning.
So the word becomes invisible. The concept is paramount.
Exactly. But in literary language, there is a disproportion. The texture, the sound, the rhythm, and the resonance of the words, the signifiers themselves, are in excess of that mere abstractable meaning.
The language flaunts its material being. It forces you to notice the tool itself.
That's it. That distinction makes a huge difference. If I tell you, don't you know the drivers are on strike? That's pure functional information.
Yeah.
We don't linger on the sounds.
But if I utter the famous line, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time," you are immediately arrested by the structure, the rhythm, the deliberate archaism, and the sound of the consonants.
The second one lends attention to its sound and its structure. That, for the formalists, is the criterion for the presence of the literary.
So let's get some context for this movement. Who were these Russian formalists, and why did they adopt this almost scientific approach?
This group, which included key figures like Victor Shklovsky, Roman Jakobson, Osip Brick, and others, they emerged just before the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and flourished really militantly throughout the 1920s.
Before being suppressed by Stalinism.
Right. Stalin preferred art that served more overt political purposes. But they were, in many ways, the first truly modern literary critics.
Oh, so?
They adopted a highly polemical, almost scientific approach. They were just tired of the previous critical generation that treated literature as, a pseudo-religion or as vague expressions of the author's soul.
Or as sociology in disguise.
Exactly. They demanded rigor. And they shifted attention entirely to the material reality of the text itself.
So they insisted that literature was not a vehicle for ideas, or a reflection of social reality, or an incarnation of some transcendental truth.
Yeah. Correct. They saw it as a specific organization of language with its own specific laws, devices, and internal structures. And it was to be studied completely divorced from psychology or sociology.
So if the literary work wasn't a reflection of the author's mind, what was it? I remember reading about an analogy of a machine.
That's it. The literary work, for them, was a material fact whose functioning could be analyzed just like you'd analyze an intricate machine. It was built from words and their relations, not from objects or feelings.
And Osip Brick took this to its logical extreme.
He did. He famously argued that Pushkin's great novel in verse, Eugene Onegin, would have been written even if Pushkin had not lived.
Wow. Meaning the poetic and structural demands of the era, the devices available, and the linguistic material itself were more deterministic than the individual author's genius. The author was just the facilitator of the form.
Exactly. And this focus on structure led them to radically redefine the traditional relationship between form and content.
Which is usually taught as content is the primary thing, and form is just the container you put it in.
The formalists completely reversed that hierarchy. They argued that content was merely the motivation of form, a kind of convenient excuse for a specific formal exercise. The literary work is really all about the manipulation of the devices.
This is where their readings become wonderfully provocative. Give us the classic formalist examples.
Okay, so they argued that Don Quixote, for instance, is not primarily about the character Don Quixote's psychology or his adventures.
It's not.
No. Instead, the character functions as a device, a convenient peg upon which to hang and unite a wide range of narrative techniques, digressions, and stylistic shifts.
And the same logic would apply to allegory, which is usually seen as completely content-driven.
Precisely. From a pure formalist perspective, you wouldn't read George Orwell's Animal Farm as an allegory of Stalinism.
So how would you read it?
You'd say that the historical events of Stalinism provided a useful, motivating backdrop for the construction of an allegory. The formal exercise was the real goal. They insisted that the social reality and the political message were simply not the critic's business. The focus must remain on the device.
So what did they identify as the unifying effect created by all these formal elements? The rhythm, the sound patterns, the strange syntax, the narrative techniques?
The unifying effect was estrangement or defamiliarization. In Russian, ostraniny.
And the function of all these literary devices
Is to deform, intensify, or twist ordinary language. It makes the familiar suddenly strange.
And what's the purpose of this making strange? Why do that?
Well, in everyday life, our perceptions become automatized. We see things habitually, stalely, recognizing them just enough to function pragmatically. If I pass the same billboard every day on my way to work, I stop truly seeing it. I just register its function.
Literature breaks that automation.
Yes, by forcing us to grapple with language in this self-conscious, non-pragmatic way, the world contained within that language is made newly and vividly perceptible. It forces us into a dramatic awareness of objects.
It's about slowing down perception. I remember Shklovsky argued this brilliantly in his analysis of Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy.
Yes. That novel perpetually delays its own story. It gets bogged down in footnotes and digressions. It barely progresses at all.
And Shklovsky called it the most typical novel in world literature.
He did, because it openly impedes the storyline, drawing blatant attention to its own mechanism. The devices are laid bare. The work is not meant to be transparent, it's meant to be opaque. That opacity, the friction of the form, is what makes it literary.
Okay, that is an ingenious way to look at it.
It is. The formalist definition is the most conceptually rigorous attempt to define literature objectively. But when we test the concept of systematic deviation of linguistic violence against linguistic reality,
It breaks down.
it ultimately breaks down due to some major practical and conceptual hurdles.
And the first philosophical hurdle is foundational. I mean, to spot a deviation, you have to identify the norm from which it swerves.
Exactly. But as our sources emphasize, ordinary language is not a reliable concept. In fact, it's an illusion.
Because there's no single homogeneous linguistic community that shares a common, unchanging currency of normal speech.
Right. Any actual living language is incredibly complex. It's differentiated by massive social factors: class,
Mhm.
region, gender, age, status, historical period. The list goes on.
So the ordinary language used by, say, Oxford philosophers has almost nothing in common with the ordinary language of a Glaswegian dock worker.
Or a 17th century peasant. The idea of a universal, stable norm for English is just a sociological fiction.
And even within the same social group, the context changes the norm. The language a teenager uses when writing a love letter is dramatically different from how they talk to their school principal.
And what might be a poetic deviation in one register might be entirely functional language in another.
And the norm itself is historically mobile. A phrase that was a mundane cliche in 15th century everyday speech might sound intensely poetic or literary to us today just because it's archaic.
And we don't have access to the social fabric of the 15th century to judge if that phrase was deviatory then. We're just reading what we perceive as deviation.
Which brings up the critical point that even if we can isolate language that deviates, that doesn't automatically make it literature.
No. Slang, professional jargon, swearing, these are all significant linguistic deviations from a supposed norm, but we don't classify them as poetry.
And the formalists themselves eventually had to concede this point, right? They realized that literariness wasn't an eternal property of a text.
But a function of the differential relations between various types of discourse.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, if everyone in an ordinary pub conversation started communicating in elaborate iambic pentameter, that language would swiftly cease to be perceived as poetic. It would just become the new functional norm.
The poetic effect relies on its contrast with the surrounding functional speech.
Exactly. And here's an even more striking practical objection. The sources argue that there is often more dense metaphor and figurative language in ordinary daily discourse, say, someone negotiating in a market or gossiping about politics, than there is in a lot of admired, laconic literary prose.
That's a great point. The intensive use of rhetorical devices, metonymy, synecdoche, all of that, is present everywhere in common communication.
So if the device itself is not unique to literature, then the device cannot define literature.
The formalist definition really only works well for poetry, the genre most overtly concerned with linguistic intensification. It struggles mightily when applied to prose.
Absolutely. The formalists tended to treat all literature as poetry, effectively extending poetic techniques to prose. But much celebrated literature includes realist or naturalistic writing, which is specifically not linguistically self-conscious.
Its virtue is its plainness, its sobriety, its laconic clarity. It does not want to draw attention to the signifier.
And again, the exclusion problem surfaces.
Okay.
Jokes, football chants, slogans, advertisements.
Which are often verbally flamboyant. They draw intense attention to the signifier. They use complex rhythms and wordplay.
But they're not classified as literature.
So the conclusion must be that the entire concept of estrangement or deviance simply cannot hold up as an objective measure.
No. And given sufficient analytical ingenuity, there is no kind of writing which cannot be read as estranging.
And this brings us to the conceptual pivot of the entire deep dive, the famous test case, the London Underground sign. Let's spend a moment analyzing this prosaic instruction to show how the literary impulse lies in the reader, not just the text.
Okay. The sign reads, "Dogs must be carried on the escalator."
So if we force a formal literary reading, we can find poetic qualities. We can be arrested by the abrupt miditory staccato of the monosyllables, dogs must be carried.
Right, and you could analyze the unusual placement of the final word, escalator, which almost mimics the rolling motion of the moving steps.
And what about the rich elusiveness of carried? It evokes so much more than just transport. It suggests carrying burdens, carrying responsibilities.
Perhaps even helping lame dogs through life as a metaphor for human suffering.
We are engaging in an act of aesthetic and formal reading, stripping the text of its pragmatic context. This is what the critic does.
And the resulting conceptual realization is vital. Literature may be as much a question of what people do to writing as of what writing does to them.
That is the essential insight. Since the inherent properties failed, not fictionality, not peculiar language, the defining characteristic must reside in the function of the discourse.
Or how we, the readers, choose to treat it.
This moves us from an objective definition of the text to a subjective definition of the reading convention.
Exactly. So literature is defined as discourse that is taken out of its immediate, practical, or pragmatic context and generalized into a statement of broader, even cosmic significance. It serves no immediate functional purpose.
The London Underground sign is the perfect anecdote to illustrate this non-pragmatic reading convention. Can you detail the story of the drunken man on the escalator?
Right, so imagine a late-night traveler, perhaps a bit worse for wear, stumbling onto the escalator, and he spots the sign, and he stops.
And he reads it.
He reads the notice, focusing his entire drunken philosophical attention on the phrase, and then he sighs and mutters to himself, "How true."
That is the literary mistake.
Yes, because he is treating a highly pragmatic, context-specific warning about animal safety as a profound, universal statement about the nature of humanity, the burden of existence, the need for mutual support.
He has prized the words loose from their practical purpose and generalized them. He has read the sign as literature.
And that's the key. So when a poet says, "My love is like a red, red rose," the metric structure, the rhythm, and the genre conventions all signal to us that we should not interrupt and ask.
Wait, is she actually physically read? Did you test this metaphor for literal accuracy?
Right. The conventions signal that we are to read non-pragmatically. We should focus on the way of talking, the linguistic act, the symbolism, the commentary on love and femininity in general, rather than the reality of what is talked about.
Which is why some suggest literature is a self-referential language. It's primarily talking about itself.
That's one way of putting it.
Now, this definition, based entirely on the reader's approach, sounds liberating, but it immediately raises some serious conceptual problems, especially regarding truth and intention.
The first major issue, what we might call the Orwell objection, is crucial. It would have surprised someone like George Orwell to hear that his great essays, say, on the Spanish Civil War or on political language, were to be read non-pragmatically.
As just pretty rhetoric, discounting the truth value and practical relevance of his factual claims.
Exactly. For much of the writing that we classify as literature, the practical historical relevance is considered vital to the overall effect.
And if literature is defined by reading practice, that means literature cannot be objectively defined at all.
No, it can't. The definition is left entirely up to the individual reader's decision, not the text's inherent nature. And this sounds like radical, unbridled relativism.
It forces us to accept that the line between literature and non-literature is completely porous.
Completely. While genres like poems and plays are intended to be non-pragmatic, this is never guaranteed. A reader might engage with Gibbon's account of Rome purely for the prose style, ignoring the historical facts.
Thus reading history as literature. And conversely, I might pick up a highly functional text, like a railway timetable, not because I need a train connection,
But because you're traveling and the long list of names and destinations stimulates general reflections on the relentless speed of modern existence.
I'm reading a timetable as literature. The power lies entirely with the reading convention I choose to apply.
The process is completely fluid, which means the status of a text can change throughout its life. A piece of writing can start off as history or philosophy, and later, once its original context is lost or its rhetoric is appreciated, be ranked as literature.
And the reverse can happen. A celebrated play might later be valued primarily for its archaeological or sociological significance, as a window into 16th century life, and cease to be read for its aesthetic qualities.
There's a marvelous phrase that summarizes this dynamic process of literary canonization.
What's that?
Some texts are born literary, some achieve literariness, and some have literariness thrust upon them.
I love that. And the deciding factor is not the text's origin or its content or its specific language,
but how people, generally speaking, treat the writing over time. What matters is the reception, not the intrinsic objective quality.
Okay, let's recalibrate this entire deep dive. We've established 3 massive failures. Literature is not defined by fictionality, it's not defined by peculiar language or form, and it is not even guaranteed by a non-pragmatic reading convention.
So if there's no fixed inherent property that runs through all works labeled literature from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf, what is the conclusion?
It seems like there isn't one.
The conclusion is the most devastatingly simple one. Literature is writing that, for some reason or another, somebody or some culture values highly.
That's it.
That's it. It is less a set of inherent textual qualities and more a number of ways in which people within a society relate themselves to writing. There's no single fixed essence of literature whatsoever.
This is a purely functional definition, which is perfectly summarized by that analogy adapted from John M. Ellis regarding the word weed.
Right. Think about the word weed. A dandelion is not ontologically a weed. It's just a plant. Weed is a functional, not an ontological term.
And it doesn't describe a specific kind of plant. It describes any plant that the gardener does not want around.
And literature is the opposite. Any writing that a society, a culture, or a specific group values highly.
So these terms, weed and literature, they tell us about the role of a text in a social context, the human practices, institutions, and beliefs clustered around it, not its fixed, inherent being.
And this functional conclusion has profound, immediate implications for anyone studying or working in the arts.
How so?
Well, if literature is just a functional category of highly valued writing, then the vast institutional apparatus, the university departments, the literary histories, the canons, that rely on the idea of literature as a stable, objective field of study.
Like entomology or geology.
Right. That whole apparatus is built on a chimera. The objects they study are not stable or self-evident.
But this functional definition instantly solves the historical puzzle we started with. Why are Lamb, Macaulay, and Mill literature, but generally not Bentham, Marx, and Darwin?
It comes down to perceived value at the time of canonization. The first three were deemed examples of what was then considered fine writing. Writing that adhered to certain class-bound, aesthetic, and rhetorical expectations of gentility and elegance.
And the works of Marx, Bentham, and Darwin, despite their massive intellectual weight.
They were perceived as too factual, too overtly political, or too scientific. They deliberately rejected the aesthetic modes required by the determining culture. The distinguishing factor was not content, but perceived cultural value.
But if we define it by value, we immediately face an objection. What about bad literature? If I define literature as highly valued writing, but I personally think a canonical author is overrated or terrible, does that mean they stop being literature?
No. That's a great question. Value judgments certainly have a lot to do with what's classified as literature, but the definition doesn't mean the writing has to be fine in every individual specimen.
It just means it has to belong to the kind of writing that is generally valued.
You've got it. So if you write a terrible poem, it is bad literature because it belongs to the valued mode poetry, or belles lettres. But if you write a terrible shopping list, it's not inferior literature.
It's just a bad shopping list.
Exactly. The term belles lettres itself is ambiguous. It denotes a type of writing that is generally highly regarded, while not necessarily committing you to the opinion that a particular piece within that category is good. You are simply recognizing its functional role in the culture.
This understanding that literature is a highly valued kind of writing is illuminating, but it carries one. While one devastating conceptual consequence that challenges every assumption we make about the Western canon.
The consequence is that we must abandon the illusion that the category literature is objective, eternally given, and immutable.
Meaning that anything can be literature, and anything currently regarded as unquestionably literature, Shakespeare, the Bible, Homer, can cease to be so.
Yes, provided the culture changes drastically enough.
That is a huge thought.
It's the core idea. Literature, in the sense of a stable, well-defined set of works with assured and unalterable value, distinguished by certain shared inherent properties, simply does not exist. We have to recognize that value is entirely transitive.
What do you mean by transitive?
It means whatever is valued by certain people in specific situations, according to particular criteria, and in the light of given purposes. It's not a fixed quality.
And the most provocative thought that follows from this: given a profound enough transformation of history, a future society might find Shakespeare's styles of thought and feelings so alien, so limited, or so irrelevant that they just can't connect with them at all.
In that case, Shakespeare would be culturally and functionally no more valuable than much present-day graffiti. We resist this idea because we are currently the culture that does value him.
But our current valuation is not an eternal decree carved into stone.
Not at all.
So this realization that value is relative and historical leads us inevitably into the realm of politics and social power. Since the literary category is defined by value, and value is applied by certain people in specific historical situations,
then the literary canon, the great tradition, is not a neutral collection. It must be recognized as a construct.
a construct fashioned by particular people for particular reasons at a specific moment in time.
Yes, there is no literary work that is valuable in itself. Regardless of what any human being might say about it, the value is always projected onto it by the reader and the society that does the reading.
This is where we have to return to a philosophical puzzle that was raised long ago by Karl Marx. He noticed a strange anomaly in cultural consumption.
Marx was puzzled about why ancient Greek art, particularly tragedy, retained an eternal charm for modern audiences.
Even though the social and economic conditions that produced it, slave labor, specific mythological belief systems, democratic structures, had long, long passed.
How could we still find value in it?
That sounds like a powerful argument for inherent objective value, doesn't it?
It does on the surface, but history hasn't ended. What if future deep archaeological or anthropological research revealed precisely how utterly remote and alien the original concerns of ancient Greek tragedy were?
We might suddenly realize that our appreciation was entirely based on reading them through the light of our own modern preoccupations.
Projecting our current values and psychological concerns onto those ancient texts.
This confirms that we are always reinterpreting and rewriting literary works in light of our current concerns. Our Homer is not the Homer read during the Middle Ages.
And different historical periods have constructed vastly different Shakespeares to suit their needs, valuing entirely different elements of his work.
So all literary works are therefore rewritten, if only unconsciously, by the societies that read them. Every act of reading is, in a sense, a rewriting.
And this fundamental instability is why what counts as literature is such a notably fluid affair, tightly bound to shifting social values.
Now, when we talk about value judgments, we have to move beyond the subjective level, like saying, I like bananas. The argument here is that these judgments are not just private matters.
No, they are rooted in a hidden, shared social and cultural network.
This is a crucial distinction to make.
It is. While one person's preference for bananas might seem private, a comprehensive analysis of food tastes across a society reveals they are deeply relevant to socioeconomic factors, cultural history, and class.
And this is even more true of the fundamental beliefs we inherit as members of a society, beliefs about human nature or health or social importance.
We share deep ways of seeing and valuing, which are inseparable from our collective social life.
And what's fascinating is that this network of unconscious value judgments informs and underlies even our most ostensibly factual statements.
Indeed. Imagine I'm an expert giving a tour, and I tell an overseas visitor, this cathedral was built in 1612. That sounds like a simple objective fact.
Okay.
But let's say the visitor comes from a culture that organizes all knowledge spatially, classifying buildings by direction northwest versus southeast rather than chronology.
The visitor would be puzzled. Why the obsession with dates?
Exactly. My statement of fact presumes a host of underlying value judgments. That chronological information is worth making. That I am the sort of person culturally entitled to make such a statement, and that the listener is a person worth hearing it.
The statement of fact is fundamentally framed by shared cultural assumptions about what counts as important knowledge.
So every descriptive statement carries what linguists call a phatic element.
Can you conversationalize that technical term for us? What's a phatic element?
The phatic element is the social handshake embedded in the sentence. When I chat to you about the weather, yes, I transmit meteorological information.
But more importantly,
I am using the conversation to signal something crucial, that I regard conversation with you as valuable, and that I consider you a worthwhile person to talk to. The act of communication itself is an affirmation of shared value and social connection.
the knowledge is never completely disinterested. We are not objective, emotionless machines just collecting facts.
Without particular interests, without a reason to care, we would have no knowledge at all because we would have no point in bothering to get to know anything. Interests are constitutive of our knowledge, not just prejudices that imperil it.
So the claim, often heard in scientific circles, that knowledge should be value-free,
Is itself a value judgment based on a specific worldview.
and this largely concealed structure of shared yet invisible values that informs and underlies our factual statements and social practices is what is meant by ideology.
Yes, ideology in this specific critical context refers to those deep, often unconscious modes of feeling, valuing, perceiving, and believing which have some kind of relationship to the maintenance and reproduction of social power.
And power relations.
And power relations. It's not just about private aesthetic taste. It relates directly to the deep-seated assumptions by which certain social groups exercise and maintain power over others, including the power to define what is great and what gets taught.
We can see how deep-seated and unconscious these values are by looking at the famous experiment in literary judgment conducted by I.A. Richards in 1929.
His study, Practical Criticism. This is the perfect illustration of ideology at work.
So what did he do?
Richards conducted a truly empirical experiment. He gave his Cambridge undergraduates a set of poems, systematically withholding the titles and the authors' names, and asked for their evaluations.
And the results?
The resulting judgments were, on the surface, incredibly variable. Some students hated the poems of time-honored masters, and others wildly celebrated obscure or sentimental verse.
Richards was surprised by the variability, but the truly profound finding, which was actually invisible to Richards himself because he was immersed in it, was the tight consensus of unconscious valuations that underlay those variable judgments.
You have to think about the demographic. The students were young, overwhelmingly white, male, upper middle class, privately educated English people of the 1920s.
So despite their surface differences, they spontaneously shared a host of assumptions about what literature should be.
Yes. What specific types of shared biases did Richards's later analysis identify?
Well, they exhibited profound shared prejudices, stock emotional responses, sentimentality, moralizing biases, and a uniform class-based rejection of anything perceived as low or overly sentimental, even if the text itself was technically skilled.
Their critical responses were deeply intertwined with broader, unexamined cultural and class beliefs. The very language they used to discuss taste and beauty was a function of their social position.
So no pure literary critical judgment exists. The aesthetic judgment is inextricably linked to social context and ideology.
The conclusion is devastating for anyone who believes in the objective purity of art. Literature does not exist in the same objective, stable sense that insects do.
And the value judgments that constitute literature.
They're historically variable, and crucially, they have a close relation to social ideologies. They refer not just to personal private taste, but to the assumptions by which certain social groups exercise and maintain power over others by defining what knowledge and expression is most worthy.
This has been a profoundly destabilizing yet necessary deep dive. We started with the confident assumption that we could define literature by objective properties, fiction, or peculiar language.
And we watch both definitions crumble under the weight of historical and linguistic reality, culminating in the realization that a simple London Underground sign can be read as literature.
And this led us to the core functional conclusion. Literature is simply writing that society, at a given historical moment, chooses to value highly.
It's an empty category filled by historical and ideological forces, maintained by institutions that implicitly uphold a structure of social power. The canon is a construct.
Which means that every time we engage with a book, every time we praise an author for their timeless genius, we are implicitly participating in a social and political act of valuation.
We are deciding what deserves to survive and what should be relegated to the dustbin of functional texts.
Exactly. So since we learned that our appreciation is never neutral, we are always rewriting Homer or Shakespeare in the light of our modern preoccupations. Here is a final thought for you to carry with you.
Think of a book you cherish, one you consider to be eternally great. If future deep historical research proved, without doubt, that this book was completely irrelevant, boring, or morally repugnant to its original audience, would you or should you stop enjoying it today?
Or does the very fact that you still find it valuable prove that you, right now, are actively defining and constructing its literary status for the world to come, proving that the literary text only exists in the dynamic interaction of the reader and their cultural moment?